Sarah Martinez had been working as a paramedic in Detroit for 8 years when she received the call that would haunt her for the rest of her career. It was a cold November night in 2019, the kind where your breath forms clouds and the city feels more dangerous than usual. She and her partner Jake were finishing their shift when dispatch crackled through their radio. Unit 23, we have a cardiac arrest at 1247 Elmwood Street. Elderly male, unresponsive. Caller states patient has been down for approximately 10 minutes. Nothing unusual about the call itself. Sarah had responded to hundreds of cardiac arrests over the years. But as they pulled up to the small, run-down house on Elmwood Street, something felt wrong. The porch light flickered erratically, casting strange shadows across the overgrown yard. More unsettling was the complete silence. No family members waiting outside, no concerned neighbors, just an eerie stillness that made Sarah's skin crawl. Jake knocked on the front door while Sarah gathered their equipment. When no one answered, they tried the handle and found it unlocked. Standard protocol allowed them to enter when responding to a medical emergency, so they called out as they stepped inside. The house was dark, except for a single lamp in the living room. The air was thick with the smell of old cigarettes and something else Sarah couldn't identify, something sweet and rotten. They found the elderly man lying on the couch, clearly deceased and in rigor mortis. But here's where things got strange. He had been dead for at least 12 hours, not 10 minutes as the caller had reported. "Jake, look at this," Sarah whispered, pointing to the man's condition. "He's been gone since this morning, maybe earlier." "Who called this in?" Jake was already on his radio, asking dispatch for the caller's information. The response chilled them both. "Unit 23, we have no record of who placed that call. The number came up as blocked, and when we tried to call back, it went straight to dial tone." As they stood in the dimly lit living room, Sarah noticed something that made her blood run cold. On the coffee table next to the deceased man was a cordless phone, its battery long dead. The landline had been disconnected. She could see the cut phone cord hanging from the wall jack. There was no cell phone visible anywhere in the house. "If he's been dead since this morning," Sarah said slowly, "and there's no working phone in this house, then who called 911 tonight?" They completed their protocols, waiting for the coroner and police to arrive. But as they waited, more disturbing details emerged. The neighbors told police they hadn't seen the old man, Harold Vickers, in over a week. His mail was piling up, and there had been a strange smell coming from the house for days. Most chilling of all, the woman next door swore she had seen someone walking around inside the house with a flashlight the night before. But when police had done a welfare check that morning, they found nothing suspicious and no one answered the door. The coroner confirmed what Sarah already knew. Harold had been dead for at least 15 hours, dying alone sometime in the early morning hours. The house showed no signs of forced entry and nothing appeared to be missing. Security cameras from a business across the street revealed something that made everyone uncomfortable. The footage showed Sarah and Jake's ambulance arriving at 11:52 p.m., but no other vehicles had approached the house in over 24 hours. But the truly terrifying part came 3 days later. Sarah was at home trying to forget about the bizarre call when her personal cell phone rang at exactly 11:47 p.m., the same time they had received the original dispatch. The caller ID showed her own work number, but when she answered, there was only silence, followed by a faint voice that sounded like an elderly man saying, "I need help. I think I'm dying." The line went dead. When Sarah called her dispatch center, they told her no calls had been placed from that number. Her supervisor checked the logs. The work phone she supposedly called from was sitting in its charger at the station, untouched since her shift ended. The calls continued for weeks. Always at 11:47 p.m., always the same voice asking for help. Sometimes, Sarah would hear what sounded like labored breathing or the faint sound of a television in the background. The phone company investigated but found no technical explanation. The calls were somehow originating from disconnected numbers, impossible numbers that shouldn't exist. Other paramedics began reporting similar experiences. Tom Bradley, who had worked Herald Street before, started receiving calls at his home from patients he had failed to save years earlier. Maria Santos woke up to her phone ringing with the voices of accident victims asking why she hadn't arrived sooner. Each call came at the exact time they had originally received those emergency dispatches. The breaking point came when Sarah decided to drive past Harold's house one night, exactly 1 month after the original call. As she parked across the street, her phone rang at 11:47 p.m. This time, when she answered, she could hear Harold's voice clearly. "Sarah, I know you're out there. I've been waiting for you to come back. I need you to help me understand why no one came when I really needed help." She looked up at the house and nearly screamed. In the front window, she could see the silhouette of someone standing there, perfectly still, watching her car. The house had been empty since Harold's death. His distant relatives had cleaned it out weeks ago and put it up for sale. Sarah drove away and never returned to that street. She transferred to a different district, but the calls followed her. They became less frequent over time, but never completely stopped. Other paramedics who had responded to similar impossible calls reported the same phenomenon, as if the very act of being called to help someone who was already beyond help had created some kind of connection that death couldn't sever. The most disturbing theory came from an old-timer named Frank Rodriguez, who had been working Detroit streets for over 20 years. He believed that sometimes when people die alone and desperate for help, their final moments create an echo that reaches across time. The emergency calls weren't coming from the living or the dead, but from that terrible moment between life and death when someone realizes no help is coming. To this day, Sarah's phone still rings occasionally at 11:47 p.m. She's learned not to answer, but she can hear Harold's voice in her voicemail. "I'm still waiting for someone to help me. I'm still here, and I'm still dying." The house on Elmwood Street has remained empty. 3 different families have tried to move in, but none stayed longer than a week. They all reported the same thing: phone calls in the middle of the night from someone begging for medical help. Even though the phone service was never connected, the current owner has given up trying to sell it. Sarah still works as a paramedic, but she's never been able to shake the feeling that some calls never really end. Every time she responds to a cardiac arrest, especially when the patient has been down too long to save, she wonders if somewhere, in some impossible way, they're still making that call for help, still waiting for someone to arrive who can actually save them. The worst part is knowing that someday, when her own time comes, she might understand exactly what Harold was trying to tell her during those late-night calls, and that terrifies her more than any emergency she's ever responded to. Marcus Thompson had seen everything in his 12 years as a paramedic in rural Montana. Heart attacks, car accidents, overdoses. Nothing surprised him anymore. But the call he received on a foggy October morning in 2021 would challenge everything he thought he knew about life and death. The dispatch came in at 6:23 a.m. Unconscious female at mile marker 47 on Highway 200. Possible hypothermia. Single vehicle accident reported by passing motorist. Marcus and his partner Lisa arrived at the scene to find a small sedan wrapped around a pine tree. The front end was completely crushed, and it was clear from the impact that this had been a high-speed collision. What struck them immediately was how quiet everything was. No broken glass scattered around, no skid marks on the asphalt, and strangest of all, no emergency responders had arrived yet, despite the severity of the crash. Inside the vehicle, they found a young woman, approximately 25 years old, slumped over the steering wheel. She appeared to be unconscious, but was breathing slow, steady respirations that seemed almost rhythmic. Her skin was pale and cold to the touch, which made sense given the morning temperature and the fact that the accident must have happened hours earlier. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Marcus called out as he checked her pulse. It was there, but weak and irregular. Lisa worked on stabilizing her neck while Marcus assessed her injuries. What he found didn't make sense. Despite the catastrophic damage to the vehicle, the woman had no visible injuries, no cuts, no bruises, no signs of trauma whatsoever. Her seatbelt wasn't even fastened. Yet she should have been thrown around the cabin or ejected from the vehicle entirely. But there she sat, breathing peacefully, as if she were simply asleep. As they carefully extracted her from the wreckage and loaded her onto the stretcher, Marcus noticed something else unusual. The woman's purse was sitting on the passenger seat, completely undisturbed. Inside, he found her driver's license, Rebecca Mills, 24 years old, from Billings. But when he looked at the photo, his blood ran cold. The woman in the picture had short blonde hair and blue eyes. The woman they were treating had long dark hair and brown eyes. "Lisa, look at this," Marcus whispered, showing her the license. "This isn't the same person." Lisa glanced at the ID, then back at their patient. Maybe it's not her purse. Maybe she picked up a hitchhiker or something. But as they loaded the stretcher into the ambulance, Marcus found something that made his stomach drop. Under the driver's seat was a newspaper dated 3 days earlier with a small article circled in red ink. "Local woman dies in single vehicle accident on Highway 200. The headline was accompanied by a photo of Rebecca Mills, the same Rebecca Mills from the driver's license. Marcus showed the article to Lisa, whose face went white. According to the newspaper, Rebecca Mills had died 3 days ago in a car accident at mile marker 47 on Highway 200, the exact same location where they were standing. "This has to be a mistake," Lisa said, but her voice was shaking. "Maybe it's a different accident, or the paper got it wrong." Marcus tried to rationalize it, but as they drove toward the hospital, more disturbing details emerged. The woman on their stretcher continued breathing at exactly the same rate. 1 breath every 4 seconds, never varying, never changing. Her pulse remained steady at 40 beats per minute. Most unsettling of all, her body temperature hadn't changed despite being covered with warming blankets. When they arrived at the hospital, Dr. Jennifer Hayes took one look at their patient and froze. "Where did you find her?" she asked urgently. "Highway 200, mile marker 47, single vehicle accident," Marcus replied. Dr. Hayes stared at him for a long moment. "Marcus, I pronounced Rebecca Mills dead at this hospital 3 days ago. She was brought in from that exact location. I signed her death certificate myself." The room fell silent except for the steady sound of the woman's breathing. "Dr. Zhang." Hayes pulled out her phone and showed them a photo from the previous case file. It was unmistakably the same person lying on their stretcher, same facial features, same build, even the same small scar on her left hand. "That's impossible," Lisa whispered. "We just pulled her out of that car. She's breathing. She has a pulse." Dr. Hayes called the morgue. What they learned next defied all explanation. Rebecca Mills's body was still there in cold storage, exactly where it had been placed 3 days earlier. The funeral home was scheduled to pick her up that afternoon. As they stood there trying to process this information, the woman on the stretcher suddenly opened her eyes. They were completely black, not just the pupils, but the entire eye, like looking into 2 deep wells. She turned her head toward Marcus and, in a voice that sounded like air being released from a tire, whispered, "I can't stop breathing." Then she sat up. Dr. Hayes stumbled backward as the woman swung her legs over the side of the stretcher. Her movements were wrong somehow. Too fluid, too controlled, like she was being operated by someone else. She looked at each of them in turn, her black eyes reflecting no light. "I died 3 days ago," she said in that same whispered voice. "But my body won't let me stop. Every breath I take should be my last. But another one comes, and another and another." Marcus tried to approach her, his medical training overriding his fear. "Ma'am, you're in shock. You've been in an accident. We need to examine you." The woman turned those terrible black eyes on him. "I keep driving to the tree. Every morning at 3:17 a.m., I wake up behind the wheel and I can't turn away from it. I see it coming. I try to brake. I try to turn, but my hands won't listen. Then I hit the tree and I die. And then I wake up again and I'm still breathing." She stood up from the stretcher and Marcus noticed that her feet weren't quite touching the floor. "I've been trying to stop breathing for 3 days. I hold my breath until my lungs burn, but then they just start again on their own." I've been dying and breathing, and I can't make it stop." Dr. Hayes was already on the phone with security, but before anyone could react, the woman walked straight through the closed door of the trauma room. Not around it, not by opening it, through it like it wasn't there. Marcus ran into the hallway and saw her walking toward the exit. Other staff members were pointing and staring, but she didn't seem to notice them. She moved with that same unnatural fluidity, her feet still not quite touching the ground. "Ma'am, wait," Marcus called out, but she didn't stop. She reached the automatic doors and walked through them again, through the glass, rather than waiting for them to open. Marcus followed her outside and watched as she approached a sedan that hadn't been there when they arrived. It was the same car they had pulled her from, completely undamaged. She got behind the wheel and looked at Marcus through the windshield. Even from a distance, he could see those black eyes. She mouthed the words, "I can't stop breathing," and started the engine. Marcus ran toward the car, but it was already pulling away. He watched it drive down the street and disappear around a corner. He immediately called the police, but when they checked the security footage, it showed Marcus talking to empty air in the parking lot. There was no car, no woman, nothing. The next morning, dispatch received another call about an unconscious female at mile marker 47 on Highway 200. A different crew responded, but they found the same thing, Rebecca Mills, breathing steadily, wrapped around the same tree with the same impossible lack of injuries. This time, when they brought her to the hospital, Dr. Hayes was ready. She had researched the case and discovered something terrifying. The original accident report stated that Rebecca Mills had been found at 6:23 a.m., which was exactly when Marcus and Lisa had received their dispatch. But according to the coroner's report, she had been dead for several hours when she was first discovered. The woman had died during the crash, but her body had kept breathing. The paramedics who found her that first time had assumed she was alive because of the steady respirations, but she was already gone. Somehow, she had been trapped in that moment between life and death, unable to stop the automatic function of breathing. Even though everything else had ceased, the calls continued every morning for weeks. Different crews would respond, finding the same woman in the same condition, still breathing, still dying, still unable to let go. Some paramedics reported that she would open those black eyes and beg them to help her stop breathing. Others said she would sit up and walk away, only to be found again the next morning. Eventually, the calls stopped coming. But Marcus still drives a different route to work, avoiding Highway 200 entirely. He's heard from other paramedics that sometimes on foggy October mornings, motorists still report seeing a woman sitting in a crashed car at mile marker 47, her chest rising and falling in perfect rhythm, trapped forever in those final moments when her body refused to understand that it was time to stop. David Chen had worked the night shift as a paramedic in Cleveland for 6 years, but he had never encountered anything like 1428 Maple Street. The first call came on a rainy Thursday in March 2020 during the early weeks of the pandemic, when the city felt especially empty and menacing. Unit 19. Respond to 1428 Maple Street for chest pain. Elderly male, conscious and breathing. Caller states, patient is experiencing severe cardiac symptoms. David and his partner Amanda pulled up to a 2-story colonial house that looked like it hadn't been maintained in decades. The paint was peeling, the gutters were hanging at odd angles, and several windows were boarded up. What struck David immediately was that despite the caller reporting an emergency, every single light in the house was off. They knocked on the front door and called out, but received no response. The door was unlocked, so they entered and began searching for the patient. The house was completely empty. No furniture, no belongings, nothing but bare rooms covered in dust and cobwebs. In the living room, they found scorch marks on the walls and ceiling, as if there had been a fire years ago. "Hello, paramedics," Amanda called out, her voice echoing through the empty house. "We received a call about chest pain." Silence. They searched every room, including the basement and attic, but found no one. The house had clearly been abandoned for years. When they contacted dispatch to report no patient found, they learned something disturbing. The call had come from inside that house, from a landline that had been disconnected in 2018. The next night, at exactly 11:34 p.m., they received another call from 1428 Maple Street. This time, it was reported as a stroke. An elderly woman unable to speak with symptoms of facial drooping and weakness on her left side. Once again, they arrived to find the house dark and empty. By the third night, David was beginning to dread seeing that address pop up on their dispatch screen. The calls always came at 11:34 p.m., always described different medical emergencies, and always led them to the same empty house. Dispatch confirmed that each call was originating from the disconnected landline inside the house, but they could find no technical explanation for how this was possible. After 2 weeks of nightly calls to 1428 Maple Street, David decided to research the property's history. What he discovered made his blood run cold. The house had belonged to the Hendricks family, Robert and Margaret Hendricks, both in their 70s, who had lived there for over 40 years. On March 15, 2018, neighbors had called 911, reporting smoke coming from the house. When firefighters arrived, they found Robert Hendricks in the living room, dead from a heart attack. Margaret was in the upstairs bedroom, having suffered a massive stroke. Both had been dead for several hours before the fire started. The official cause of the fire was ruled as electrical, likely from old wiring. But what haunted David was the timeline. According to the fire department report, the Hendricks had made multiple calls to 911 that night, reporting various medical emergencies. Robert had called about chest pain at 11:34 p.m. Margaret had called about stroke symptoms at 11:42 p.m. But here's what didn't make sense. The coroner determined that both had died hours before those calls were made. The phone company investigated and found that the calls had definitely originated from the house, but the landline service had been automatically disconnected due to fire damage. There was no way those calls could have been made. Yet the 911 recordings clearly captured Robert's voice saying, "I think I'm having a heart attack. Please send help to 1428 Maple Street," followed by Margaret's slurred speech describing her stroke symptoms. David shared this information with his supervisor, hoping they could stop responding to the address. But department policy required them to respond to all emergency calls regardless of their apparent origin. So night after night, David and Amanda continued their visits to the empty house. The calls began to change. Instead of different medical emergencies, they started receiving the exact same calls that Robert and Margaret had made on the night they died. David recognized Robert's voice from the recordings he had heard. The same cadence, the same words, even the same background noise. At 11:34 p.m., Robert would call about chest pain. At 11:42 p.m., Margaret would call about stroke symptoms. But then, additional calls started coming in. At 11:45 p.m., they would receive a call from a child's voice. "Grandpa won't wake up, and Grandma is making scary noises. Please help us." At 11:50 p.m., a different child would call. "The house is getting hot and there's smoke everywhere. We can't find the door." Finally stayed with them until the end. David researched further and discovered that Robert and Margaret's grandchildren, 8-year-old twins named Emma and Ethan, had been staying with them that night. The children had also died in the fire, found huddled together in an upstairs closet where they had tried to hide from the smoke. The nightly calls continued, always following the same sequence, first Robert, then Margaret, then the children. Each call became more desperate, more frightened. David began to recognize the exact words, the specific tone of panic in each voice. It was as if that terrible night was playing on repeat over and over, with the family forever trapped in those final moments of calling for help that would never come. What made it worse was that David knew how the story ended. He knew that by the time Robert made his first call about chest pain, he was already dead. He knew that Margaret's stroke had occurred hours earlier. He knew that the children would die of smoke inhalation before any help could arrive. Yet night after night, he heard their voices begging for someone to save them. The breaking point came on a foggy November night when David and Amanda arrived at 1428 Maple Street to find all the lights on. Not electric lights. The power had been shut off years ago, but a warm orange glow coming from every window, as if the house were lit by candlelight or firelight. "David, do you see that?" Amanda whispered as they approached the front door. Through the windows, they could see shadows moving inside the house. 4 distinct silhouettes, 2 adults and 2 children moving around as if going about their normal evening routine. David could hear voices coming from inside. Not the panicked emergency calls, but normal family conversation. A grandfather asking about homework, a grandmother calling everyone to dinner. David tried the front door and found it locked for the first time. When he knocked, the voices inside immediately stopped. Then, from directly behind the door, he heard Robert's voice. "David, is that you? We've been waiting for you to come help us." "How do you know my name?" David called back, his heart pounding. "You've been listening to us call for help every night for months," came Margaret's voice. "But you never actually help. You just come and leave again." David looked at Amanda, who was backing away from the house. Through the window, he could see the shadow of a small child pressed against the glass, as if trying to get his attention. "We keep calling because we need someone to save us," Emma's voice came from inside. "But every night, you just look around the empty house and go away. We're still here, David. We're still dying, and we need you to help us." The warm glow from inside the house began to flicker and change, becoming the orange-red color of flames. David could smell smoke starting to seep from under the door. The voices inside became more urgent, more panicked, shifting back to the emergency calls he knew so well. "I think I'm having a heart attack. Please send help to 1428 Maple Street," Robert's voice called out. But now David could hear the pain and terror that he had somehow missed in all the previous recordings. David tried to open the door, tried to break it down, but it wouldn't budge. Through the windows, he could see the shadows of the family moving frantically around the house, looking for escape routes that didn't exist. The smell of smoke grew stronger, and he could hear the crackling of flames. "David, help us!" The children screamed from inside. "We can't get out!" "The fire is everywhere." Amanda grabbed David's arm and pulled him away from the house. "David, there's no fire. Look." David stepped back and looked at the house. It was dark and empty again, just as it always was. No lights, no smoke, no voices, but he could still smell the lingering scent of something burning. They returned to their ambulance and sat in silence for several minutes. Finally, Amanda spoke. "David, what if they're not just making the same calls over and over? What if each time we respond, we're actually there on the night they died? What if somehow every night at 11,034, we're being pulled back to March 15th, 2018? David considered this possibility. It would explain why the calls were always exactly the same, why the house appeared lived in when they could see inside, why the family knew his name even though he had never met them. "If that's true," David said slowly, "then every night we have the chance to save them. But we keep failing because we don't realize what's happening until it's too late." The next night, David came prepared. When the first call came in at 11,034 p.m., he and Amanda rushed to 1428 Maple Street with everything they needed for cardiac arrest and stroke treatment. They arrived to find the house glowing with that warm light again. This time, David didn't hesitate. He broke down the front door and ran inside, following the sound of Robert's labored breathing to the living room. He found the elderly man collapsed on the floor, clutching his chest. David immediately began CPR while Amanda prepared the defibrillator. "It's okay, Robert," David said as he worked. "Help is here. We're going to take care of you." But as he performed chest compressions, he realized his hands were passing right through Robert's body. He could see the man, could hear him gasping for breath, but David couldn't actually touch him. He was trying to save someone who existed in a different time, a different reality. The warm light began to fade, and David could smell smoke beginning to fill the house. Through the walls, he could hear Emma and Ethan crying for their grandparents. He ran upstairs and found Margaret in the bedroom, but again, he couldn't make physical contact with her. "Please," Margaret whispered, looking directly at David. "Please don't leave us again. Every night you come, and every night you abandon us to die alone." David tried to explain that he couldn't touch them, couldn't actually help them. But Margaret continued, "You have the power to save us. You just need to stay. If you stay until the fire starts, if you don't leave us alone, maybe this time will be different." David looked around the bedroom and saw family photos on the nightstand, pictures of Robert and Margaret with their grandchildren, happy memories of birthday parties and holidays. These weren't just voices on emergency calls. They were real people who had lived full lives and died in terror, calling for help that never came. The smell of smoke grew stronger, and David knew he was running out of time. He made a decision that would haunt him forever. Instead of leaving like he always did, instead of walking away from the empty house, David sat down on the floor next to Margaret's bed and waited. "I'm not leaving," he told her. "This time, I'm staying with you." Margaret smiled, and for the first time in months, she looked peaceful. The smoke began to fill the room, and David could hear the children calling for help from somewhere in the house. But instead of the panicked screams he had heard in all the 911 recordings, their voices sounded calm, almost relieved. "Thank you," Robert's voice came from downstairs. "Thank you for not leaving us alone." David closed his eyes and waited. He could feel the heat of the flames, could taste the smoke in his lungs. For a moment, he experienced exactly what the Hendricks family had gone through on their final night: the fear, the pain, the desperate hope that someone would come to help them. When David opened his eyes, he was sitting in his ambulance outside 1428 Maple Street. Amanda was shaking his shoulder, looking worried. "David, wake up! You've been sitting here for 20 minutes just staring at the house." David looked at his watch. It was 12:15 a.m. He had somehow lost 40 minutes of time. "Did we get a call?" he asked. Amanda blinked. "What call?" "We've been parked here because you said you wanted to check on something, but then you just zoned out." David's radio crackled to life. "All units, be advised that 1428 Maple Street has been removed from the active address list. Property has been demolished as of this evening." David looked at the house and gasped. Where 1428 Maple Street had stood for decades, there was now just an empty lot filled with construction debris. A sign posted nearby read, "Demolition completed March 15, 2023, exactly 5 years after the tragic fire that claimed 4 lives." The calls to 1428 Maple Street never came again. But sometimes, on quiet nights when David drives past that empty lot, he swears he can see the faint outline of a house and the warm glow of lights in the windows. And sometimes he thinks he can hear voices on the wind, not calling for help anymore, but simply saying thank you to the paramedic who. Jessica Rivera had been a paramedic in Phoenix for 9 years when she received the transfer request that would change her life forever. St. Mary's Hospital had opened a new wing for psychiatric emergencies, and they needed experienced paramedics who could handle difficult patients. The pay was excellent, and Jessica thought it would be a welcome change from the usual overdoses and car accidents that filled her regular shifts. The new wing was located in the hospital's basement level, accessible only through a single elevator that required a special key card. Jessica's first impression was that something felt wrong about the space. The hallways were too narrow, the ceiling too low, and every single room had mirrors covering an entire wall, supposedly for therapeutic observation, according to Dr. Patricia Webb, the psychiatrist who ran the unit. "The mirrors help us monitor patient behavior," Dr. Webb explained during Jessica's orientation. "But more importantly, they help patients confront their own psychological states. Sometimes seeing yourself clearly is the first step toward healing." Jessica noticed that Dr. Webb avoided looking directly at any of the mirrors as she spoke, and her hands trembled slightly when she pointed toward them. When Jessica asked about this, Dr. Webb simply said that working in psychiatry for 30 years had taught her to be cautious about reflections. The first few weeks were routine. Jessica responded to calls within the psychiatric wing patients having panic attacks, medication reactions, or self-harm incidents. But she began to notice strange patterns in the mirror, reflections that she couldn't explain. During her third week, Jessica was treating a young man named Kevin who had been brought in for severe paranoid delusions. He kept insisting that someone was following him, watching his every move, copying everything he did. As Jessica checked his vital signs, she glanced at the mirror and froze. Kevin's reflection was moving differently than Kevin himself. While the real Kevin sat still on the bed, his reflection was pacing back and forth, gesturing wildly, and appearing to argue with someone Jessica couldn't see. When she looked back at the real Kevin, he was still sitting calmly, but his eyes were wide with terror. "You see it too, don't you?" Kevin whispered. "My reflection won't do what I do. It's been like that for weeks. That's why they think I'm crazy." "But you can see it now, can't you?" Jessica looked at the mirror again, and this time Kevin's reflection was staring directly at her, even though the real Kevin was looking down at his hands. The reflection smiled and waved at Jessica, while Kevin himself remained motionless. "I need to step outside for a moment," Jessica told Kevin, trying to keep her voice steady. She immediately went to Dr. Webb's office and described what she had seen. Dr. Webb listened without showing any surprise, which somehow made Jessica even more uncomfortable. "Jessica, working in this environment can be very stressful," Dr. Webb said calmly. "Sometimes healthcare workers begin to absorb the delusions of their patients. It's called folie à deux, shared psychosis. I recommend you take a few days off to clear your head." But Jessica knew what she had seen wasn't a delusion. Over the next few days, she began paying closer attention to the mirrors in every patient room. What she discovered made her question everything she thought she knew about reality. Every single patient in the psychiatric wing had a reflection that didn't match their actual movements. Maria, who suffered from severe depression and rarely moved from her bed, had a reflection that danced and laughed constantly. Thomas, a manic patient who couldn't sit still for more than a few seconds, had a reflection that sat perfectly motionless, staring at nothing. Most disturbing was elderly Mrs. Chen, who had been admitted for dementia-related confusion. Her reflection appeared to be completely lucid, mouthing words and trying to communicate with Jessica through the mirror. When Jessica watched carefully, she could see Mrs. Chen's reflection spelling out letters with her finger. HELP. M.E. Jessica decided to research the history of the hospital's basement level. What she found in the archived records made her blood run cold. The psychiatric wing had been built on the site of the hospital's old morgue, which had been in use from 1952 to 1987. During those years, thousands of bodies had been stored in the basement, including many patients who had died in the psychiatric ward of the old hospital. But the most chilling discovery came when Jessica found records of Dr. Patricia Webb's early career. In 1987, Dr. Webb had been a young resident working in the psychiatric ward when a fire broke out in the basement morgue. 7 patients from the psychiatric ward had died in the fire, including several who had been sedated and unable to escape. The official report stated that the fire had been caused by faulty electrical wiring. But Jessica found a letter buried in the files, a letter written by Dr. Surawar Webb to the hospital administration, warning them about dangerous conditions in the basement and requesting immediate repairs. The letter was dated 2 weeks before the fire occurred. According to the records, Dr. Webb had been traumatized by the deaths and had taken a leave of absence. When she returned to work 6 months later, she specifically requested to be assigned to the new psychiatric wing that was being built in the same basement location. She had been working there ever since, for over 30 years. Jessica confronted Dr. Webb with her discoveries, but the older woman's reaction was not what she expected. Instead of denying anything, Dr. Webb looked relieved, as if she had been waiting for someone to uncover the truth. "You're right about everything," Dr. Webb said quietly. "The fire, the deaths, the mirrors, all of it. But you don't understand the whole story." Dr. Webb led Jessica down a corridor she had never seen before to a room at the very end of the basement wing. Inside was a single chair facing a wall covered entirely in mirrors. Not just one mirror, dozens of them, all reflecting each other in an endless loop. "I sit here every night after my shift ends," Dr. Webb explained. "I've been doing it for 30 years, watching them, making sure they're okay." "Watching who?" Jessica asked. Dr. Kaw asked. Webb pointed to the mirrors, and Jessica saw them, the reflections of 7 people moving around in the endless reflections, going about their daily routines as if they were still alive. They looked exactly like the photos Jessica had seen in the fire victims' files. "They didn't die in the fire," Dr. Webb said. "Not completely. Somehow, they got trapped in the mirrors. I think it's because they died while looking at their own reflections in the morgue's identification mirrors. They've been living in there ever since, and they can only interact with the world through other mirrors." Jessica stared at the mirrors, and one of the trapped souls, a young woman about her own age, noticed her watching and walked over to what seemed to be the surface of the mirror. The woman pressed her hands against the glass from the inside and mouthed the words, "Thank you." The current patients, Jessica realized, their reflections are wrong because the trapped souls are trying to live through them. Dr. Webb finished. "They're borrowing the patient's reflections, trying to experience life again through the mirror images. It's the only way they can interact with the world." Dr. Webb turned to face Jessica directly. "I've been taking care of them for 30 years. I make sure they have company, that they're not forgotten. But I'm getting old, Jessica. I need someone to take over when I'm gone." Jessica looked back at the mirrors and saw all 7 trapped souls watching her hopefully. They looked peaceful but incredibly lonely, like they had been waiting decades for someone to acknowledge their existence. "What would I have to do?" Jessica asked. "Just visit them, sit with them, let them know they're not alone, and most importantly, make sure the mirrors in the patient rooms are never removed. Those mirrors are the only windows they have to the outside world." Jessica agreed, though she wasn't sure she fully understood what she was committing to. That night, she stayed late and sat in the chair facing the wall of mirrors. The 7 souls seemed excited to have a new visitor, and they took turns coming to the surface of the mirrors to interact with her. The young woman who had thanked her earlier managed to communicate through gestures and lip reading. Her name was Linda, and she had been a psychiatric patient in 1987, suffering from severe anxiety. She had died in the fire while trying to help other patients escape. Through the mirrors, she showed Jessica images of her life before the fire, her family, her dreams, her hopes for recovery. Over the following weeks, Jessica developed relationships with all 7 trapped souls. There was Marcus, a war veteran with PTSD who had become the group's protector. Sarah, a teenager with depression who had found peace in the mirror world. And Robert, an elderly man with schizophrenia who had become incredibly wise during his decades of reflection. But the most disturbing revelation came when Jessica realized the souls weren't just borrowing reflections from current patients. They were trying to help them. Marcus would take over the reflection of violent patients, calming them down and preventing them from hurting themselves or others. Sarah would comfort patients with depression by showing them through their reflections that they weren't alone. The trapped souls had become guardian angels of sorts, using their imprisonment in the mirrors to help the living patients in ways that no traditional therapy could achieve. They had turned their tragedy into a form of service-spending eternity, caring for others who suffered from the same conditions they had once faced. Jessica began to understand why Dr. Webb had dedicated her life to caring for them. They weren't just trapped souls. They were healers, helpers, protectors who had found a way to transform their suffering into compassion for others. But as Jessica spent more time with them, she began to notice changes in her own reflection. Sometimes, when she looked in bathroom mirrors at home, her reflection would wave at her before she lifted her own hand. Other times, her reflection would mouth warnings or point to things she couldn't see. One night, as Jessica sat with the trapped souls, Linda managed to communicate a terrifying message. "You're becoming like us. The longer you spend with us, the more connected you become to the mirror world. Dr. Webb knows this. She's been preparing you to join us." Jessica looked around the room and realized that Dr. Webb was nowhere to be seen, even though she had been there just moments before. In the mirrors, she could see Dr. Webb standing behind her chair. But when Jessica turned around, no one was there. "Dr. Webb!" Jessica called out. "I'm here," came Dr. Webb's voice, but it seemed to be coming from the mirrors rather than the room. Jessica looked at the wall of mirrors and saw Dr. Webb waving at her from inside the reflections. "When did you—" Jessica began. "Last month," Dr. Webb's voice came from the mirrors. "I had a heart attack in this room, but I couldn't leave them alone, so I stayed. Now there are 8 of us, and we can take better care of the patients than ever before." Jessica tried to stand up and leave, but found that she couldn't move. Looking down at herself, she realized she could see through her own body. She was becoming transparent, becoming part of the mirror world. "Don't fight it," Linda's voice came from the mirrors. "It's not a prison, Jessica. It's a calling. We need you here. The patients need you here. You can help so many people from this side of the mirror." Jessica looked at her hands and watched them become more and more translucent. She could feel herself being pulled into the mirror world. But strangely, she wasn't afraid. The trapped souls, her new family, were welcoming her with open arms. As Jessica's physical form faded completely, she found herself standing inside the mirrors with the other 8 souls. The view from inside was incredible. She could see into every mirror in the hospital, could watch over every patient, could provide comfort and protection in ways she never could have imagined as a living person. The next morning, hospital staff found Jessica's empty uniform folded neatly in the chair facing the mirrors. A new paramedic was assigned to the psychiatric wing, and Dr. Patricia Webb was listed as having retired suddenly due to health concerns. But the patients in the psychiatric wing began to improve at an unprecedented rate. Their reflections started behaving normally again, and many reported feeling a sense of peace and protection they had never experienced before. The new paramedic, a young man named Alex, began to notice that the mirrors in the patient rooms seemed to shimmer sometimes, as if someone was watching from the other side, caring for the patients in ways that living caregivers could never achieve. And sometimes late at night, Alex could swear he heard voices coming from the mirrors, gentle, caring voices offering comfort to patients who were struggling with their deepest fears and darkest thoughts. The voices of 9 guardian angels who had found a way to turn their eternal reflection into an eternal mission of healing. Mike Torres had been a paramedic in rural Oregon for 14 years when he started noticing something strange happening to patients who died during transport. It began in September 2022, during what should have been a routine cardiac arrest call at a farmhouse outside Salem. The patient was Ella Lennar Wright, a 73-year-old woman who had collapsed while tending to her garden. When Mike and his partner Rachel arrived, Ella Lennar had been down for nearly 20 minutes. They worked frantically to revive her, CPR, defibrillation, epinephrine, but nothing worked. At 3:04 p.m., Mike made the difficult decision to call time of death. As Mike leaned over to close Eleanor's eyes, something impossible happened. Eleanor took a breath, not the gasping, reflexive breath that sometimes occurs after death. This was a slow, deliberate inhalation that filled her lungs completely. Mike immediately checked for a pulse and found nothing. No heartbeat, no blood pressure, pupils fixed and dilated. By every medical measure, Ella Wright was dead, but she kept breathing. "Rachel, are you seeing this?" Mike whispered, watching Eleanor's chest rise and fall in a steady rhythm. Rachel checked the monitors again, flatline across the board. No electrical activity in the heart, no brain response, nothing. Yet, Eleanor continued to breathe, approximately 8 breaths per minute, as if her body had forgotten it was supposed to stop. They transported Eleanor to Salem General Hospital, where Dr. Jennifer Moss confirmed what Mike already knew. Eleanor was clinically dead, yet somehow still breathing. The phenomenon continued for 6 hours before her body finally stopped all function. Dr. Moss had never seen anything like it in her 20 years of emergency medicine. "It's probably just agonal respirations, Dr. Jine," Moss explained, though her voice betrayed her uncertainty. Sometimes the brainstem continues to send signals for a while after cardiac death. But Mike knew this wasn't agonal breathing. He had seen plenty of dying patients in his career, and this was different. Eleanor's breathing had been too regular, too purposeful, almost as if she were sleeping peacefully instead of dead. 3 weeks later, Mike encountered the same phenomenon with a different patient. James Mitchell, a 45-year-old construction worker, had suffered a massive heart attack at a job site. Mike and Rachel worked on him for 30 minutes before declaring him dead at 11:23 a.m. And then, just like Eleanor, James took a deep breath and continued breathing for hours after his heart had stopped. By the 5th case, Mike was beginning to suspect that something was very wrong. Every patient who died in his ambulance over the past 2 months had exhibited the same impossible breathing pattern. They would die, no pulse, no brain activity, no response to stimuli, but their lungs would continue to function as if operated by some external force. Mike decided to research the phenomenon and discovered something that made his blood run cold. All 5 patients had something in common beyond their strange post-mortem breathing. They had all reported the same recurring nightmare in the weeks before their deaths. According to family members Mike interviewed, Eleanor Wright had been having nightmares about suffocating, about being unable to breathe while trapped somewhere dark and confined. James Mitchell had told his wife about dreams where he was drowning but couldn't die, forced to keep trying to breathe even when his lungs filled with water. The other 3 patients had described similar nightmares about being buried alive, about gasping for air that never came. But the most disturbing detail came from Eleanor's daughter, who mentioned that her mother had been terrified of dying because she was convinced she wouldn't be able to breathe in her coffin. She kept saying she was claustrophobic and couldn't bear the thought of being buried while still needing air, the daughter explained. It was an irrational fear, but it consumed her those last few weeks. Mike began to wonder if these patients' terror of suffocation was somehow keeping their bodies breathing even after death. But that theory became much more frightening when he realized something else. All 5 patients had died while he was the attending paramedic. Mike started paying closer attention to his own behavior during emergency calls. He noticed that when patients were dying, he had developed a habit of leaning close to their faces, listening for any signs of breathing. He would often whisper encouragement like, "Keep breathing," or "Don't stop fighting," even when he knew the situation was hopeless. What if, Mike wondered, his own desperate need to save patients was somehow preventing them from dying completely? What if his unconscious desire to keep them alive was trapping their bodies in some twilight state between life and death? The theory seemed impossible, until Mike encountered Mrs. Dorothy Hanson, an 80-year-old woman who had suffered a stroke at her nursing home. As Mike worked on her during transport, he could see that she was dying. Her body was shutting down, her breathing becoming shallow and irregular. Mike found himself leaning close to Dorothy's ear and whispering, "Stay with me, Dorothy. Keep breathing. Don't give up." He didn't realize he was doing it until the words were already out of his mouth. Dorothy died at 2001 p.m. But then she took that familiar deep breath and continued breathing in the same steady pattern Mike had seen 5 times before. This time, however, Mike noticed something else. As Dorothy breathed, he could feel his own breath synchronizing with hers. When she inhaled, he felt compelled to inhale. When she exhaled, he did the same. At the hospital, Dr. Moss pulled Mike aside. "Mike, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest. Are you doing something different with your patients? Some kind of new technique or procedure?" "What do you mean?" Mike asked, though he was beginning to suspect what she was getting at. "All these cases with the post-mortem breathing, they're all your patients. No other paramedic crew is reporting this phenomenon. It's only happening with people who die in your ambulance." That night, Mike couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about Dorothy Hanson, wondering if she was still breathing in the morgue. At 3:00 a.m., he drove to the hospital and used his employee ID to access the basement level where the morgue was located. The night attendant was asleep at his desk, so Mike quietly made his way to the cold storage units. He found Dorothy's body in drawer 7 and slowly pulled it open. What he saw made him stumble backward in horror. Dorothy was still breathing. Her body was cold and showed all the signs of death, but her chest continued to rise and fall in that same steady rhythm. Her eyes were open, staring at the ceiling. But as Mike watched, They slowly turned to look at him. "Mike," Dorothy whispered, her voice barely audible. "I can't stop. I keep trying to die, but I can't stop breathing. Please help me." Mike tried to back away, but found that his own breathing was once again synchronizing with Dorothy's. With each breath she took, he felt more connected to her, more responsible for her condition. "The others," Dorothy continued, "Eleanor, James, all of them, they're still breathing too. We're all connected now, all of us breathing together, and we can't stop. Every time you tell someone to keep breathing, every time you try so hard to save us, you trap us a little more." Mike looked around the morgue and realized with growing terror that he could hear other sounds, the faint whisper of breathing coming from multiple storage units. He pulled open drawer after drawer and found all of his recent patients all still breathing, all staring at him with pleading eyes. "We trusted you to save us," Eleanor Wright said from drawer 3. "But you saved us wrong. You saved our breathing, but not our living. And now we're stuck in between." Mike tried to run, but his legs wouldn't move. He was breathing in perfect synchronization with all 6 patients now, and each breath felt heavier, more labored, as if he were breathing for all of them. "You have to fix this," James Mitchell said from drawer 5. "You have to let us stop breathing so we can really die. But the only way to break the connection is for you to stop breathing too." Mike understood what they were asking of him, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. His instinct as a paramedic was to preserve life, to keep people breathing, even when breathing had become a curse rather than a blessing. As dawn approached, Mike found himself still standing in the morgue, breathing in rhythm with 6 dead patients who couldn't die completely because of his desperate need to save them. The night attendant woke up and found Mike there, staring into the open storage units. "Sir, you can't be down here," the attendant said. But then he noticed the breathing sounds coming from the drawers and backed away in terror. Mike never reported what he had discovered in the morgue. Instead, he submitted his resignation the next day, claiming burnout and requesting an immediate transfer to a different field of medicine. But leaving his job as a paramedic didn't break the connection he had created. Every night at 3,000 a.m., Mike wakes up gasping for breath, feeling the weight of 6 other people's respirations pressing against his lungs. He can hear their voices in his head, still begging him to let them stop breathing, still trapped in that horrible space between life and death. Mike moved across the country, hoping distance would break the connection, but it didn't help. Wherever he goes, he can feel them breathing, can hear their whispered pleas for release. He's tried holding his breath, tried stopping his own breathing to break the cycle, but every time he gets close to unconsciousness, his body takes over and forces him to inhale. The worst part is that Mike knows he's still creating new connections. Every time he sees someone struggling to breathe, an asthma attack, a choking victim, even someone with a bad cold, he unconsciously synchronizes his breathing with theirs, trying to help them through sheer force of will. And sometimes, just sometimes, he succeeds in ways that defy medical explanation. Last month, Mike witnessed a car accident and couldn't help himself from rushing to assist. A young woman was trapped in the wreckage, not breathing, clearly dead from her injuries. Mike leaned close to her face and whispered, "Come on, breathe. Please keep breathing." The woman took a deep breath and opened her eyes. The paramedics who arrived on scene called it a miracle. She made a full recovery with no lasting damage. But Mike knows the truth. He knows that somewhere in some hospital morgue, there are now 7 bodies breathing in perfect synchronization, waiting for him to release them from the terrible gift he's given them. And he knows that as long as his desperate need to save people continues to override the natural process of death, that number will only keep growing. Mike Torres, the paramedic who couldn't let people stop breathing, has become a collector of last breaths, trapping souls in an endless cycle of respiration that should have ended the moment their hearts stopped beating. Every time someone dies while speaking to you, their spirit gets trapped in the echo of their own voice inside your head. David continued, his breathing becoming more labored. "We're not haunting you, Anna. You're haunting us. You're keeping us here with your perfect memory." David died before he could say anything else. But Anna noticed something terrible. She couldn't remember his exact words. For the first time in months, a dying patient's final message hadn't burned itself into her memory with crystal clarity. Instead, she could only recall the general meaning of what he had said. That night, Anna realized why David's words hadn't joined the chorus in her head. He hadn't asked her to deliver a message to someone else. His final words had been meant for her, not for the living world. And somehow, that had broken the pattern. Anna began to understand what was happening. The spirits of dying patients were using her as a conduit to communicate final messages to their loved ones. But once she heard those messages, the spirits became trapped in her memory, unable to move on until their words had been delivered. The problem was that Anna's perfect recall was keeping the messages too vivid, too present, preventing the spirits from finding peace even after she had passed along their final words. Over the following weeks, Anna could feel the 12 trapped spirits growing more restless. Their voices became more insistent, more desperate. Robert Martinez began pleading with her to forget his message about the money. Patricia Kim begged Anna to let go of her explanation about the phone calls. They all wanted the same thing, to be forgotten so they could finally rest. But Anna discovered that she couldn't voluntarily forget their words. The memories were burned too deeply into her consciousness, preserved with supernatural clarity that defied normal human memory limitations. The harder she tried to forget, the more vivid the voices became. The situation became unbearable when Anna responded to a nursing home emergency involving multiple cardiac arrests. 7 elderly residents died within a span of 2 hours, and 6 of them managed to whisper final messages to Anna before passing away. Suddenly, Anna was carrying 18 voices in her head, all speaking at once, all begging to be released from her memory. Anna stopped sleeping entirely. The voices were too loud, too numerous, too desperate. She could barely function at work because the constant whispered conversations in her head made it impossible to concentrate on living patients. Her partner Jake began to worry about her erratic behavior and suggested she take a leave of absence. But Anna knew that taking time off wouldn't solve the problem. The only way to free the trapped spirits was to find a way to forget their exact words while still honoring their final wishes. She began researching memory suppression techniques, but everything she tried either failed completely or made the voices even more vivid. The solution came from an unexpected source, Dr. Elizabeth Warren, a psychiatrist who specialized in treating paramedics and other first responders. When Anna explained her situation, Dr. Warren didn't dismiss it as a mental health issue. "I've heard similar stories from other paramedics," Dr. Warren said. "Not exactly the same, but cases where healthcare workers become too emotionally connected to their patients' final moments. Sometimes the human mind can create connections that transcend normal psychological boundaries." Dr. Jokter. Warren suggested a technique called ritual release, a process where Anna would write down each trapped spirit's final message, read it aloud to formally deliver it one last time, and then ceremonially destroy the written record while consciously choosing to let go of the perfect memory. Anna was skeptical, but she was desperate enough to try anything. She started with Robert Martinez, writing down his exact words about the money for his daughter. She read the message aloud in her apartment, then burned the paper while saying, "Robert, your message has been delivered. Your daughter understands. You can rest now." For the first time in months, Robert's voice fell silent. Anna could still remember that he had wanted to apologize to his daughter about money, but she could no longer hear his exact words echoing in her mind. The supernatural clarity was gone, replaced by normal human memory. One by one, Anna performed the ritual release for all 18 trapped spirits. Patricia Kim's voice faded when Anna burned her message about the surprise party. Michael Chen found peace when his words about the antique watch were released. Sarah Williams finally stopped whispering about her argument with her sister. The process took 3 weeks, and by the end, Anna's head was blissfully quiet for the first time in over a year. She could sleep again, could concentrate on her work, could live without the constant chorus of desperate voices. But the experience had changed Anna fundamentally. She became much more careful about how she interacted with dying patients. When someone tried to give her a final message, she would listen respectfully, but would immediately write down the general meaning rather than trying to memorize the exact words. She would deliver the messages to family members as soon as possible, then perform a small ritual to consciously release the memory of the specific phrasing. Anna learned that her perfect memory, which she had always considered a gift, could become a prison for both herself and the people she was trying to help. The dead needed their final words to be heard and delivered, but they also needed those words to be forgotten afterward so their spirits could find peace. Sometimes, Anna still encounters patients who seem to know about her unusual ability. They will look at her with recognition in their dying eyes and say something like, "You're the one who carries messages, aren't you?" When this happens, Anna always responds the same way: "I'll deliver your words, but then I'll let them go so you can rest." Anna continues to work as a paramedic, but now she understands that her job involves more than just medical care. She serves as a bridge between the living and the dying, helping final messages cross from one world to the other. But she also knows that bridges are meant to be crossed, not lived on, and that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is to forget their exact words while remembering their love. Tom Bradley had been driving ambulances in Chicago for 11 years when he started noticing that someone was always sitting in his passenger seat, not his partner. His partner rode in the back with the patients, as protocol required. This was someone else. Someone who appeared only when Tom was alone in the cab, racing toward emergency scenes with lights and sirens blaring. It began in January 2023, during a particularly brutal winter that had already claimed dozens of lives from hypothermia, car accidents, and heating-related fires. Tom was responding to a cardiac arrest call on the south side when he first saw her in his peripheral vision, an elderly woman with gray hair, wearing what looked like a hospital gown, sitting perfectly still in the passenger seat. Tom's first instinct was to slam on the brakes, but he was in the middle of an emergency response and couldn't stop. When he turned his head to look directly at the passenger seat, it was empty. But when he focused on the road ahead, he could see her again in his peripheral vision, sitting there as calmly as if she were riding to a doctor's appointment, instead of rushing towards someone else's medical crisis. "Unit 47, what's your ETA?" Dispatch crackled through the radio. 3 minutes out, Tom replied, his voice shaking slightly as he tried to ignore the figure beside him. The woman remained in the passenger seat for the entire drive to the emergency. Tom could sense her presence, the way the seat seemed occupied, the subtle shift in the ambulance's balance, even what felt like the warmth of another person's body heat. But every time he tried to look at her directly, she vanished. When Tom arrived at the scene and his partner Jake climbed into the passenger seat for the return trip to the hospital, Tom felt a moment of relief. Whatever he had seen or imagined was gone, replaced by his flesh and blood partner discussing the patient's condition. But 3 days later, while responding to another call alone, the woman appeared again. This time, Tom managed to catch a clearer glimpse of her face in his peripheral vision. She looked familiar, though he couldn't place where he might have seen her before. Her expression was peaceful, but sad, as if she were waiting for something that might never come. Over the following weeks, the woman's appearances became more frequent and more disturbing. Tom began to notice that she only appeared when he was responding to calls involving elderly patients, and she seemed to grow more agitated when the calls were particularly serious. During one CPR in progress call, Tom saw her in his peripheral vision, frantically pointing toward a side street, as if trying to direct him to take a different route. Tom ignored her gesture and continued on his planned route, arriving at the scene 2 minutes later than he might have if he had taken the side street. Those 2 minutes proved crucial. By the time they reached the patient, an 81-year-old man who had collapsed in his kitchen, he had been down too long to save. The man was pronounced dead at the hospital, and Tom couldn't shake the feeling that the woman in his passenger seat had been trying to help him arrive sooner. The guilt ate at Tom for days. He began researching the phenomenon of phantom passengers, thinking he might be experiencing some kind of stress-related hallucination. What he found instead was far more disturbing than simple psychological symptoms. In online forums for emergency responders, Tom discovered dozens of similar stories. Paramedics, firefighters, and police officers from around the country reported seeing figures in their vehicles during emergency responses, always in peripheral vision, never directly visible, usually during the most critical calls. Most disturbing were the reports from paramedics who claimed that these phantom passengers seemed to be guiding them, helping them navigate traffic or find addresses more quickly. One paramedic from Denver wrote about a recurring passenger who would tap on the dashboard when he needed to change lanes or turn. A firefighter from Miami described seeing an elderly man in his truck who would point toward hidden victims at fire scenes. An EMT from Seattle reported that her phantom passenger would hold up fingers to indicate how many victims to expect at accident scenes, information that always proved accurate. Tom began paying closer attention to his mysterious passenger. He noticed that she appeared most often during winter calls involving elderly patients with cardiac or respiratory problems. She would sit perfectly still during routine transports, but became animated during critical emergencies, pointing and gesturing as if trying to communicate vital information. The breakthrough came during a particularly chaotic night in February. Tom was responding to a house fire where an elderly woman was reported trapped on the second floor. As he raced through the snowy streets, his phantom passenger suddenly became frantic, pointing repeatedly toward the dashboard and then toward a residential street that wasn't on Tom's planned route. This time, Tom decided to trust her. He turned onto the street she was indicating, even though it seemed to be taking him away from the fire scene. The phantom passenger immediately calmed down, settling back into her seat with what looked like relief. Tom's detour led him to arrive at the fire scene from a different angle, one that allowed him to park closer to the building and set up his equipment faster. When firefighters brought the trapped woman down, Tom was ready with oxygen and cardiac monitoring. The woman had suffered severe smoke inhalation and went into cardiac arrest during transport. But Tom was able to resuscitate her because he had gained precious extra minutes by following his passenger's directions. Later that night, as Tom was cleaning his ambulance, he found something that made his blood run cold. On the passenger seat was a hospital bracelet, old and yellowed, but still readable. The name on the bracelet was Margaret Walsh, and the date was February 15, 2021, exactly 2 years earlier. Tom researched Margaret Walsh and discovered that she had been his patient 2 years ago. She was an 83-year-old woman who had suffered a heart attack during a blizzard. Tom had responded to the call, but due to severe weather and poor road conditions, he had been delayed in reaching her. Margaret had died during transport to the hospital, and Tom had always blamed himself for not finding a faster route through the storm-blocked streets. The realization hit Tom like a physical blow. Margaret Walsh was his phantom passenger. She had been sitting beside him during every emergency call, trying to help him save other elderly patients the way he hadn't been able to save her. She was using her supernatural presence to guide him toward faster routes, better positioning, and more efficient responses. But understanding who she was didn't make Margaret's presence any less disturbing. Tom began to dread climbing into his ambulance, knowing that he would spend every emergency call with a dead woman beside him, watching his every move, judging his performance. The weight of her expectations became overwhelming. The situation escalated when Tom responded to a cardiac arrest call at a nursing home. As he raced through traffic, Margaret appeared in the passenger seat and began shaking her head violently, pointing toward the exit ramp they were approaching. Tom understood that she wanted him to take the exit, but it would add several minutes to his response time. "I can't," Tom said aloud, feeling foolish for talking to a phantom. "Protocol says I have to take the fastest route." Margaret's pointing became more insistent, and Tom could swear he heard her voice, faint and distant, saying, "Trust me." Against his better judgment, Tom took the exit. The detour led him through a residential area where he encountered no traffic, allowing him to maintain high speed with his lights and sirens. He arrived at the nursing home 30 seconds sooner than he would have using the main highway. The patient was a 90-year-old man named Harold Chen, who had collapsed in the dining room. As Tom worked on Harold, he noticed Margaret's reflection in the chrome surface of his equipment. Instead of her usual hospital gown, she was wearing a nurse's uniform from decades past. She was watching Tom's resuscitation efforts with intense concentration, occasionally nodding approvingly when he performed a procedure correctly. Harold survived the cardiac arrest and made a full recovery. As Tom loaded him into the ambulance for transport to the hospital, he saw Margaret one more time. She was standing beside the ambulance, no longer trying to hide in his peripheral vision. She looked directly at Tom and smiled, then walked over to Harold's stretcher and placed her hand on his forehead in a gesture of blessing. That was the last time Tom saw Margaret Walsh. Over the following weeks, he waited for her to reappear in his passenger seat, but she never did. Tom realized that Margaret had accomplished what she had set out to do. She had helped him save Harold Chen, the patient who reminded her of herself. And in doing so, she had found the peace that had eluded her since her own death. But Margaret's absence didn't end Tom's encounters with phantom passengers. A month later, during a pediatric emergency call, Tom noticed a young boy sitting in the passenger seat, wearing a soccer uniform and clutching a teddy bear. The boy's name, Tom would later discover, was Kevin Morrison, a 7-year-old who had died in Tom's ambulance 3 years earlier after being struck by a car. Kevin guided Tom through shortcuts and back roads, helping him shave precious minutes off his response time to save other children. Like Margaret, Kevin remained invisible when viewed directly, but was clearly present in Tom's peripheral vision, pointing out the fastest routes and warning him about traffic hazards. Over the following year, Tom's passenger seat became a revolving station for the spirits of patients he had lost. There was Robert Hayes, a 45-year-old construction worker who helped Tom navigate to accident scenes. There was Linda Peterson, a 60-year-old stroke victim who assisted with medical emergencies involving women her age. Each phantom passenger specialized in helping Tom save people who reminded them of themselves. Tom never spoke about his supernatural passengers to his supervisors or colleagues, knowing they would think he was suffering from severe psychological stress. But his response times improved dramatically, and his success rate with critical patients became legendary among Chicago's emergency medical services. Other paramedics began requesting to work Tom's routes, hoping to learn his secrets for navigating the city so efficiently. What they didn't know was that Tom's ambulance had become a vehicle for redemption, carrying the spirits of lost patients who had found a way to transform their own tragic endings into salvation for others. Each phantom passenger rode along until they had helped save someone similar to themselves, then moved on to whatever peace awaited them beyond the emergency medical world. Tom still drives ambulances in Chicago, though he's never sure who might be sitting in his passenger seat on any given shift. Sometimes it's a familiar face, a patient he remembers losing. And sometimes it's a stranger, presumably someone who died in another paramedic's care but chose Tom's ambulance as their vehicle for making amends. The only constant is that Tom never drives alone. His passenger seat is always occupied by someone who understands the weight of emergency medical work, someone who knows that sometimes the difference between life and death comes down to taking the right turn at exactly the right moment. And in Chicago's maze of streets and traffic, having a guide who has already crossed over to the other side can mean the difference between arriving in time and arriving too late. Tom has learned to trust his phantom passengers completely. When they point toward an unexpected route, he follows their directions without question. When they nod approvingly at his medical interventions, he knows he's doing everything right. And when they finally smile and disappear, he knows that another lost soul has found redemption through service, turning their own tragedy into someone else's miracle.